The Grinning Man. My name is Matthew Calamane, and I am a writer and director of the feature film titled The Grin, a story that is based on true events that actually happened on the set where it was filmed, or otherwise known as the house from my childhood. I found myself at home one weekend night. My parents were out of town, and I was returning from a canceled sleepover. The lights were on when I got in the door, and I remember getting a phone call from the same friend shortly thereafter, which would end up being the last normal event of the night. My brother was playing video games in the next room, and I could hear him tapping furiously at the video game while I spoke on the cordless phone. I walked around the living room and ended the phone call in the kitchen, when I remember hearing some kind of high-pitched squeal that came from the house somewhere. I couldn't place where it was coming from, as it sounded the same in every room I went to investigate in. It ended after about a minute after it started and was interrupted by the phone ringing. But the phone wasn't in the kitchen where I left it. It was in the bathroom on the counter in front of the sink. I answered the phone and there was nobody there, so I hung up. It was at that point where I heard a dragging sound, like a large, heavy object was being dragged in the attic crawl space above me. I followed the sound as it slowly navigated from room to room, and ended up in my parents' bedroom, who still had a waterbed. After the sound made it to the far wall, it stopped and the phone rang again. This time my friend was on the other end of it. I told him what was going on and he told me to be careful and call the police. After I got off the phone, I laid down on the waterbed and was horrified to find a body-shaped, solid object inside the waterbed mattress, and I leapt out. I then heard a knock on the door and answered it quickly, but nobody was there. It was at this point where my brother called me from his room to check something out that he had just discovered in the game he was playing. And a little more than annoyed at his lack of interest in what was going on, I stormed into his room. There was nobody there. His bed was made and the room was spotless. Neither the console nor the TV was on, and the controller was wrapped up and unplugged. There's no way he could have hid and cleaned his room in a few seconds it took for me to make it from the front door to his room. I had been alone the entire night, hearing for 20 straight minutes my brother playing a game that he wasn't even playing. The phone rang again, but once again, it was not where I left it. This time it was resting on the kitchen counter where I'd left it originally, so I walked the entire house to answer it. It was my friend calling once again, this time saying that the call was dropped for some reason and he was calling me back. I explained what had just happened, and there was another knock at the door. Since I was standing right next to it, I peeked out the window within 2 seconds of the knocks, but there was no one there. At this point, I opened the door and stepped onto the porch to make sure I didn't see anyone running away, as I had a large, wide-open yard, and there wasn't really anything to hide behind. I walked into the yard to look around, but I couldn't find anything. I found myself engaged in several more minutes of talking before my friend got off the line, and it was that moment where I realized that the place I'd been staring off into while talking, there were 2 very large, black, reflective eyes looking back at me. The figure was tall and lanky and stood only 10 feet or so from me, in the shadow cast by the front of the garage from the front door light. The most notable feature he wore was an inhumanly large smile, and he was grinning with oily metallic teeth from literally ear to ear. Despite me staring directly at him for more than 5 minutes, I pretended I didn't notice him, and through willpower alone made it inside the house without running as fast as I could, and instead I walked calmly. I remember feeling like if I ran he would chase me, and somehow knew that he would have caught me easily. I barricaded myself in the room the rest of the night and didn't fall asleep until the sun came up the next morning and my parents were home. Nothing like that ever happened to me before, and nothing like that has ever happened since. The Walk. Preface. I'm a 23-year-old woman, and I'm half Cherokee from Georgia, USA. At the time that the story took place, my fiance and I were living on a large farm in Maryland. We didn't use the farm, but we were renting a small house on the property, and we were free to come and go on the grounds as we pleased. I was only 19 at the time this took place, and the only residents in our home were myself, my fiance, and our cat and dog. Our cat was a lunatic barn cat that I had rescued because I can't say no to animals that need our help. And our dog was my loyal pit bull, who's a sweet, cuddly, scaredy cat. She weighed about 75 pounds, and she's afraid of her own shadow. Our farm was situated on about 20 acres of land, and our driveway was about half a mile long. So usually when I would get home from work, my dog and I would go for a walk, and usually I brought my fiance with me. Not that I was afraid to go out alone, just that he spends too much time playing games and not using his legs. After our driveway was a 12-mile long road through woods and farms until it finally reconnected with civilization. So it was safe to say that we were far from other people except for our landlord, of course. The first mile was through open farmland, followed by a brief patch of forest, and then about half a mile of wheat fields, and then solid forest for 2 more miles. Now that you have a bit of a layout, onto the really creepy part. So it started off like any other weekday evening. My fiance and I returned home from work to our happy cottage and our happy pets. Harley, our dog, was frantic to go for a walk, so I quieted her and changed into walking clothes and asked if my fiance wanted to join me. He got home shortly after me and said he had seen one of the coyotes that we have close to the field by our house. But as you may know, coyotes are mostly scavengers, especially out here on the East Coast, so I wasn't too worried, and I'm very capable of defending myself. I called him a puss and then told Harley that we can go and that we would be fine without him. Laughing to myself, we left the cottage and started walking towards the driveway. The sun was already going down and the October air had started to get a chill to it, and it rustled through the cornfields next to our long driveway. The corn was about 6 feet tall at this point in the air and impossible to see through, so I assumed that my fiance was just trying to scare me because there's no way he could have seen a coyote in this field. Harley was enjoying her time in the field, tearing in and out of the corn stalks on our walk up the driveway, and I knew that with as big of a coward as she was, that she would alert me to any danger very quickly by running away. By the time I reached the end of the driveway, the sun had set and the moon, which had already come out, was shining high above the fields. It wasn't quite full, but it provided enough light that I didn't need to use my flashlight or Harley's collar light. We turned left down the road and proceeded across the first section of field. The first field was soybeans, and if you don't know what they are, they're relatively short plants that nothing but a rabbit could hide in. And off in the distance, I spotted a few deer, but nothing alarming, so we relaxed and enjoyed our walk through the night. I threw a stick and Harley brought it back over and over again. Typical dog stuff. We reached the first small section of the trees and Harley stopped and bumped into my leg, letting me know that there was something ahead. It wasn't a coyote or a deer, but there was a rabbit that had been hit by a passing car and was still struggling. As much as I hate to say this, there was no way it was going to live, and honestly, it's probably what drew the coyote pack in. I knelt down by it, and using my knife quickly, I put it out of its misery, as my family had taught me, and let it pass into the next life. Feeling sad, but somewhat relieved that all we had encountered was a handful of deer and that poor rabbit, we continued our walk and passed into the next field. This was a wheat field, and the wheat was about ready to be harvested, so it was quite tall and hard to see through. The field was quiet, though, and Harley didn't do anything, so I figured that the coyotes had passed on if there had been any at all. Now this is the part you've been waiting for. I don't know what it was, but here it is. We rounded the corner of the field and into an area with wheat on our left and the forest on our right, and the air just seemed to go still. Harley got closer to me and I heard rustling in the wheat field. I saw 3 tails circling back towards the forest. Coyotes. The eastern coyotes are small, but in a pack they could get pretty ballsy. Harley raised her haunches and I yelled, "Get out of here, go on." Typical stuff as loud as I could to get the coyotes to go. The coyotes, startled, scattered off into the trees. I decided to turn around and get out of there before they could decide to regroup. Because I'm brave, but I'm not going to walk into a darkened forest with a coyote pack and a coward pit bull. We turned to head back, and again, I heard a rustling in the wheat. Was it a confused coyote? I had thought it must be. But no, Harley was standing completely still, staring at the wheat, and I whistled for her to come with me, the high-pitched, ear-piercing whistle with 2 fingers. That snapped her out of it for a second, but her attention was returned to what was inside the wheat. All of a sudden, all the family legends I had heard came flooding back to me, and I expected to see a tall, thin creature emerge. But nothing did. I didn't smell rotting meat or feel a sense of dread. Instead, I was transfixed with fear and curiosity. I whistled again, and the whistle was returned. A very human-sounding whistle, but at the same time, not. Against my better judgment, I called out, "Hello?" My own voice replied, "Hello." I put my hand on my knife and called out for them to show themselves. I received silence. No bugs, no coyotes, no Harley noises, just my own breath. Slowly the rustling started again, and I turned on my flashlight. I shined it on the wheat field, and what I saw still confuses me to this day. Animal eyes, that green-yellow reflection of the light, was cast back at me, but what it connected to didn't make sense. There was a girl, no more than 14 or 16, crouched in the wheat. She wore what I think must have been some kind of deerskin or fur, but otherwise was naked. She was very thin, and looked as though her skin had never seen sunlight. Her hair was long and tangled with wheat and leaves. Under any other circumstances, I would have said she was beautiful, but at that moment, she was terrifying. We stared at each other for what must have been a solid minute or so, but it felt like an eternity, until I heard the unmistakable coyote howl from the forest. Both of our heads snapped towards the noise, and immediately I heard her take off through the wheat towards the sound. At the same moment, Harley took off towards our house, and I went after her. We didn't stop running until we got to the driveway, and I stopped, not wanting my fiancé to know I was running away from something. I could still hear the howling in the distance, and we started to walk at a brisk pace. We made it back to the cottage with no further problems, and I didn't tell my fiancé about it, not wanting him to go out with the gun. She hadn't hurt me, so I didn't think it was right to hunt her. I woke in the middle of the night that night by the sound of coyotes outside her cottage. This wasn't unusual, but I now wondered if she was with them. When I was coming home from work about a month later, I had stopped obsessing about that night, and I almost thought I had imagined it, when I had to slam on the brakes for something in the road. It was dark, and when my headlights hit it, its eyes reflected yellow and green. It was a large coyote, and it just stared at my car for a moment, and ran off into the woods. I know it sounds crazy, but I still wonder if that was her.